Cameras were barred, but transcripts later revealed what unfolded, a legal masterclass that left even the court's own clerks in awe. She cited case law with such confidence and accuracy, it disarmed even Judge Harlan. "You cited a precedent from the Ninth Circuit," he said, surprised, flipping through the documents. "That case isn't commonly referenced in this district." "Because most counsel don't go deep enough," she replied coolly. "But I did. And that ruling, Santos versus United States, makes clear that punitive fines without due process violate constitutional protections. Your fine, sir, was made in haste and anger, not in law." The judge leaned back in silence. There was no rebuttal. He recessed again, but this time not out of contempt, out of uncertainty. Within 2 days, the fine was quietly withdrawn. The court issued a revised statement clarifying that no contempt had occurred, and Judge Harlan issued a rare, awkward acknowledgement: Ms. Crockett's legal arguments were compelling. The matter is resolved. The headlines were brutal. Judge tries to silence Crockett, gets schooled on his own bench. Crockett, the courtroom queen who fought back. From defendant to defender, how Jasmine Crockett just changed the game. But for Crockett, it wasn't about headlines. It was about sending a message, to those in power, to those who underestimated her, and to every young black girl watching who thought she had to shrink to survive in rooms that weren't made for her. She didn't just walk into that courtroom with fire, she walked in with facts, with preparation, with brilliance honed through years of fighting battles most politicians wouldn't dare touch. She reminded everyone that credentials don't make you powerful, courage and competence do. The same people who tried to fine her into silence were now quoting her legal arguments in law reviews. Universities began inviting her to speak not just as a congresswoman but as a legal tactician. Civil rights organizations began citing her case as a new precedent for courtroom conduct protections. What started as a punishment became a platform. And Jasmine? She didn't let up. In an interview weeks later, when asked what she thought of Judge Harlan now, she simply smiled and said, "I think he learned something." And that's what courtrooms should be for: truth, growth, and justice, not ego. The interviewer paused, then asked, "Would you go back to law?" She laughed. "I never left. Politics is law. And the courtroom is just another chamber of power." And with that, she adjusted her mic, stood, and walked off set, leaving a legacy not just in Congress but in every courtroom that ever tried to hold her back. In a packed courtroom buzzing with anticipation, the murmurs barely quieted as the gavel came crashing down. Judge Raymond Harlan, known for his stern demeanor and no-nonsense approach to order, narrowed his eyes as he scanned the room. At the center stood Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, defiant, composed, and unapologetically fierce. What had started as a routine hearing on government overreach had spiraled into something the media dubbed a legal standoff for the books. And at the core of it all was Crockett, sharp-tongued, articulate, and unwilling to be silenced. Judge Harlan had warned her repeatedly during proceedings, demanding she keep her tone respectful and refrain from dramatic cross-examinations, but Crockett wasn't there to play polite politics, she was there to expose the rot hiding beneath polished testimony and empty suits. And that rubbed the old guard the wrong way. When she laid into a witness who had ties to a corporate lobbying firm, dismantling his story piece by piece with surgical precision, the courtroom erupted. Her words were fire, but her method was exact, legally sound, and brutally effective. Yet, Judge Harlan didn't take kindly to being upstaged in his own court. With furrowed brows and flushed cheeks, he interrupted her mid-sentence, slamming the gavel again. "Miss Crockett, you are in contempt of court," he barked. "I hereby fine you $5,000 for disorderly conduct and will recess until counsel can review their decorum." Gasps filled the air. Even the stenographer paused. Cameras from major news outlets zoomed in as Crockett's expression didn't falter. She stood tall, unshaken, lips curled in a calm, amused smile. "Respectfully, Your Honor," she said smoothly, I would like to challenge that ruling on constitutional grounds. Your fine is an abuse of discretion that violates my First Amendment rights in the context of public interest litigation." Harlan scoffed. "This is my courtroom. You don't get to make legal arguments on the fly." But what he didn't realize, what many in that room didn't realize, was that before Jasmine Crockett was a congresswoman, she was a criminal defense attorney, a relentless fighter in the trenches of injustice. She wasn't just another politician with a law degree, she was the real deal. That night, the news channels couldn't stop airing the clips. Pundits argued whether Crockett had gone too far. Social media exploded with hashtags like #Crockett versus the system and #LegalLioness. But behind the scenes, Jasmine was preparing. Within 48 hours, her legal team filed a motion not only challenging the fine but also accusing the judge of procedural overreach and political bias. She represented herself at the hearing. Judge Raymond Harlan thought he was just handling another disruptive presence in his courtroom when he slammed the gavel and leveled a $5,000 contempt of court fine against Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett. Known for her fiery courtroom demeanor and fearless political voice, Crockett had raised more than a few eyebrows during the hearing, challenging witnesses, grilling testimonies, and making it clear that she wasn't going to be silenced by decorum if truth was being buried. Harlan, a traditionalist who had little patience for theatrics in his court, mistook Crockett's passion for disorder. But what he didn't realize was that the woman standing before him wasn't just a politician trying to score points, she was a legal tactician, a woman forged in the fires of real courtroom warfare where people's lives and futures were on the line. Before stepping into politics, Jasmine Crockett had spent years defending those without voices, the wrongly accused, the poor, the overlooked. She didn't come from privilege, she came from purpose. And when Harlan dropped that fine on her, thinking it would humble her into submission, he triggered something deeper. He awakened the litigator who had never left, just shifted battlefields. The media went wild with the drama. Pundits on all sides dissected the exchange, some calling it a necessary check on conduct, others accusing the judge of overreach and ego. But behind the headlines, Crockett was working. She didn't whine. She didn't tweet complaints. She built her legal response brick by brick with the same tenacity that had won her case after case back in her law days. She filed a formal objection, representing herself, challenging not just the fine but the very basis of the contempt ruling. And when she walked back into that courtroom for the hearing, it wasn't to plead, it was to teach. She walked through constitutional law with the elegance of a professor and the force of a warrior. She cited Supreme Court precedent. She referenced obscure circuit court decisions that even the clerks had to double-check. She called out procedural errors and used the judge's own previous rulings as comparative evidence of inconsistency. It wasn't just a defense, it was a dismantling of the assumption that she had crossed any legal line. "The courtroom is not immune to scrutiny," she said at one point. "Judges are not beyond question, especially when constitutional rights are in play." She spoke calmly, firmly, but with undeniable authority. It wasn't arrogance, it was mastery. By the time she was done, even Judge Harlan had to acknowledge the strength of her argument. He recessed the hearing and days later reversed the fine. It was quiet, almost embarrassed, a motion filed under review, citing ambiguity in the original ruling and acknowledging the compelling nature of Crockett's objections. But the world had already taken notice. Legal blogs were ablaze. Law schools started using the case as a modern example of courtroom rights and the tension between judicial authority and individual liberty. Young law students, especially women and minorities, watched Jasmine Crockett and saw what was possible, how the law could be wielded not just defensively but as a sword against the very systems that tried to cage its power. Her story was no longer just about a fine, it was about redefining what legal strength looked like in a courtroom that wasn't always built for voices like hers. She proved that knowing the law was more than just memorizing statutes, it was about understanding the principles behind them, being able to articulate them when it mattered, and being fearless enough to challenge anyone who misused them, even a judge with decades on the bench. Crockett didn't come for war that day, but when war came for her, she didn't flinch. She didn't raise her voice, she raised her argument. She didn't fold, she flourished. The same judge who tried to fine her into silence ended up having to acknowledge her legal prowess in a backhanded admission of error. But Crockett didn't need his apology. She had something better: vindication in the public record, respect from her peers, and a platform elevated not by scandal but by skill. What she reminded everyone was that the courtroom is supposed to be a place of balance, of fairness, and of accountability. And accountability goes both ways. She showed that being a woman, being bold, being black, being loud when necessary, doesn't disqualify you from being brilliant. In fact, sometimes it's the very fire people fear that proves your worth. She didn't just walk out of that courtroom, she walked out having rewritten the narrative. She was no longer just the Congresswoman who got fined, she was the legal genius who made the law work the way it was meant to.